The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the five-star restaurant, their crystal reflections dancing over the polished mahogany floors. The scent of seared steak, aged wine, and truffle butter filled the air as finely dressed elites clinked their glasses, reveling in the luxurious ambiance. Conversations buzzed in quiet arrogance, deals being made over a sip of Bordeaux, fortunes being discussed between forkfuls of caviar. At the center of it all sat Richard Calloway, a white billionaire CEO, his presence commanding attention. His suit alone cost more than most people's yearly salaries, and his laughter rang louder than anyone else's. Flanked by his business partners, Richard was celebrating another multi-million-dollar acquisition, and the wine was flowing freely. Meanwhile, weaving between tables with practiced ease, was Elijah. Young, black, and sharply dressed in his waiter's uniform, he moved with precision, ensuring every guest was served without flaw. His posture was straight, his expression professional, even as most of the wealthy diners barely acknowledged his existence. As Elijah approached Richard's table with a tray of drinks, one of the billionaire's drunken associates smirked, nudging his boss. "Hey, Richard," the man slurred, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Why don't we have a little fun?" Richard leaned back, swirling his wine, an amused smirk playing at his lips. "What do you have in mind?" The associate's gaze flickered toward Elijah. "Let's see if the help can entertain us. How about you sing for us, boy?" A ripple of laughter spread across the table. Elijah's grip on the tray tightened, his jaw clenching, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm just here to serve your meals, sir," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. Richard chuckled, but there was an edge of condescension in his tone. "Come on now, don't be shy. Give us a little tune. Surely someone like you grew up singing in a church choir, right?" The laughter grew louder. Some of the other patrons were beginning to turn their heads, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Elijah remained still, his breath slow and controlled. He knew exactly what this was, a public humiliation dressed up as playful banter. He had seen it before. He had experienced it before. Richard, emboldened by the crowd's amusement, leaned forward, voice dripping with mock encouragement. "What's the matter? Too good to entertain your betters?" Elijah's eyes met Richard's, and for a brief moment there was silence. A challenge lingered in the air, though neither man had spoken it aloud. Then, something shifted in Elijah's stance. Slowly, he placed the tray down on the table with deliberate care. He inhaled deeply, straightened his shoulders, and parted his lips. And then, he sang. But it wasn't just any song. It was an aria, a voice, rich and full of soul, poured out into the restaurant. A deep, powerful, haunting melody that silenced every single voice in the room. The laughter died. Conversations halted. Forks hovered in midair. The sound was breathtaking. Elijah's voice climbed effortlessly, filling the grand dining hall with a raw, chilling beauty that gripped every soul present. The resonance of each note seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an almost supernatural force. Richard's smirk had vanished. His associates sat frozen, eyes wide in shock. Around the restaurant, guests who had previously ignored the scene were now transfixed, jaws slack, eyes glistening. By the time Elijah reached the final note, the restaurant was so silent that the faintest breath could have been heard. Then, applause, not hesitant, not polite, thundering. Customers leapt from their seats, clapping wildly. Some whistled, others wiped away tears. Elijah simply stood there, the weight of his talent sinking into every stunned face around him. Then, from the far end of the restaurant, another voice rang out. "Elijah Carter?" The entire room turned toward the source. A well-dressed older man, seated in the VIP section, was rising from his chair. He was a world-renowned opera director, one whose mere presence in any room commanded respect. Richard's face paled. "Elijah Carter," the director repeated, stepping forward, his eyes brimming with excitement. I knew I recognized that voice. You performed at Carnegie Hall 2 years ago." A stunned gasp rippled through the room. Whispers began. "Carnegie Hall? The waiter?" Richard's throat went dry. Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady. "That's right." The director's face broke into a delighted smile. "I had no idea you were working here. I assumed—" He shook his head, almost laughing at his own disbelief. "You belong on the world's greatest stages, my boy. What on earth are you doing in a place like this?" Elijah smiled, his expression unreadable. "Paying the bills." The director turned to Richard's table, his eyes now filled with disdain. "And these men?" Elijah glanced at Richard, his gaze steady. "Just a few people who didn't recognize talent when it was right in front of them." The billionaire looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. The director clapped Elijah on the shoulder. "I won't allow this to continue. You're coming with me." Elijah nodded, picking up his tray. "Let me just clock out." A single snicker broke the stunned silence. Then another. Then uncontrollable laughter. At Richard's expense. The very same elites who had laughed with him earlier were now whispering behind his back, shaking their heads in disgust. Some filmed his reaction, ready to share the moment the arrogant billionaire had been publicly humbled. As Elijah walked past Richard's table, he leaned down slightly and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Looks like I entertained you after all." With that, he walked out, shoulders squared, head high, stepping into a future that was far brighter than Richard Calloway could ever buy. Elijah's voice begins softly, rich and controlled, the deep timbre sending an unexpected shiver through the room. The melody is slow and haunting, weaving through the air like a spell. A few guests shift in their seats, their forks hovering over their plates, their wine glasses frozen mid-sip. It isn't the lively, entertaining tune Richard was expecting. No, it's something else, something powerful. Richard's smug grin falters as the weight of the song presses against him. Elijah's voice swells, filling the grand dining hall with a raw intensity that seems to carry centuries of pain, struggle, and resilience. The notes vibrate against the walls, thick with emotion, commanding the attention of every single person in the restaurant. The laughter that had once accompanied Richard's taunt is gone. The only sound left is Elijah's voice, steady and unwavering. But Richard isn't a man who enjoys being bested. His jaw tightens, his ego bruised by the fact that the entertainment he demanded is now controlling the entire room. His friends glance at him uneasily, sensing his growing agitation. He clenches his wine glass, his fingers pressing into the delicate crystal until suddenly, crack! The glass shatters in his grip, wine splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth. The sharp sound slices through the moment, breaking Elijah's song mid-note. A few gasps ripple through the restaurant. Elijah stands frozen, his voice abruptly silenced, his body tensed. He watches as Richard slowly rises to his feet, shaking the wine droplets from his hand. His face is unreadable, but his eyes burn with quiet fury. "I asked for a performance," Richard sneers, his voice low and dangerous. "Not a damn funeral march." A nervous hush falls over the room. Even the waitstaff, used to wealthy diners throwing their weight around, hesitate in their movements. No one dares to speak. Richard takes a step forward, towering over Elijah. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he mutters, his words slow and deliberate. "Standing there, acting like you have a choice?" He scoffs, glancing around at the silent crowd. Look at him, acting like some kind of artist, like he's worth something. Elijah's expression remains calm, but his knuckles tighten at his sides. He doesn't flinch, doesn't give Richard the reaction he wants. That only enrages the CEO further. "You're just a waiter," Richard spits, grabbing Elijah's shoulder roughly, "and you'll do as you're told." The second his hand makes contact, chairs scrape against the floor as several guests shift forward instinctively. sensing danger. The elderly black man watching from the corner of the restaurant sets down his napkin, his face dark with fury. Elijah doesn't move, his body rigid under Richard's grip, but his eyes, those sharp, unyielding eyes, don't waver. "Take your hand off me," he says, his voice steady. Richard laughs, but it's forced. "Or what?" he taunts, tightening his grip. At that moment, the restaurant doors swing open. A new presence enters, moving with authority. A man in a tailored suit, accompanied by two assistants, strides into the room, his sharp gaze scanning the scene. The moment his eyes land on Elijah, his expression shifts from curiosity to recognition. His lips part slightly as realization dawns. Richard, oblivious, smirks at the sudden interruption. "Good," he says, assuming the new arrival is someone of importance. Maybe now someone can remind this little worker of his place. The man's eyes flick between Richard and Elijah, taking in the broken glass, the spilled wine, the tension in the air. Then he turns fully to Elijah. "Elijah Carter?" he asks, his voice carrying across the restaurant. A few people exchange surprised glances. Richard stiffens slightly. "You know him?" he asks, his smug confidence wavering. The man ignores him. His attention remains locked on Elijah. "I thought I recognized that voice," he says, stepping forward. His expression softens. "You performed at Carnegie Hall 2 years ago." A hushed gasp moves through the restaurant. Carnegie Hall? The waiter? Richard's face drains of color. Elijah finally speaks, his voice cool. "That's right." The man turns to Richard now, his gaze hard as steel. "And who exactly are you to demand that someone like Elijah Carter sing for your amusement?" Richard opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. He looks around, realizing the shift in power. The confidence, the control, it's gone. And in its place, humiliation creeps in. The elderly black man, who had been watching with quiet rage, finally stands from his seat. He buttons his jacket and speaks for the first time. "Do you even understand who you just put your hands on?" Richard swallows hard, sweat forming at his brow. The entire room is staring at him now, waiting for his reaction. But it's too late. The weight of his arrogance, his disrespect, his ignorance, it's all crashing down at once. Elijah stands still, unmoved by the chaos around him, because he knew all along. Richard Calloway was about to regret everything. At first, Elijah's voice is barely a whisper, a soft and steady hum that barely rises above the clinking of glasses and hushed whispers in the grand dining hall. But then, like a slow-burning ember igniting into an uncontrollable flame, his voice swells, filling the room with an unshakable force. It rolls through the restaurant like a tide, each note carrying a weight of raw emotion, piercing through the arrogance and entitlement that once dominated the space. One by one, people pause. Silverware is lowered, conversations cut short, glasses frozen mid-air. The air shifts. The same wealthy patrons who moments ago laughed now sit motionless, their smirks wiped away by something far more powerful than their money, undeniable, breathtaking talent. The staff, who have been conditioned to remain invisible, suddenly stop what they're doing, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The melody moves through the room, gripping hearts and tightening throats. It's not just a song. It's a force, a declaration, a story told in sound. Every note is carried with soul, drenched in something deeper than performance, truth, history, resilience. Elijah doesn't just sing, he commands the moment. His voice reverberates off the marble floors and high, glistening ceilings, rising higher and higher, breaking through every assumption, every preconceived notion, every unspoken bias that had been suffocating him moments ago. A woman sitting at a nearby table blinks rapidly, her hands clasping against her chest as tears slip down her face. A wealthy businessman, who had been chuckling along with Richard moments ago, shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping his napkin a little too tightly. Even Richard's business partners glance at each other, their expressions unreadable, but no longer filled with amusement. Richard himself sits frozen, his jaw clenched. What was meant to be a degrading, humiliating display has transformed into something else entirely, something bigger than him, something he can no longer control. The power dynamic has shifted, slipping from his fingers like sand. He had thought himself untouchable, the king of the room, but now, under the weight of Elijah's talent, he feels something foreign creeping into his chest. It's not anger, it's not annoyance, it's something more terrifying, insignificance. Elijah reaches a soaring high note, holding it effortlessly, the kind of sound that seeps into the bones and lingers long after it's gone. The room, already silent, seems to tighten around that one perfect note, as if the very walls themselves are listening, absorbing its power. Then, slowly, he lets the final note fade, hanging in the air for a moment, like a ghost refusing to leave. And then, thunder. Applause bursts through the room like a tidal wave crashing against a rocky shore. It starts with a single clap, hesitant, before spreading like wildfire. A standing ovation. Chairs scrape against the marble floor as people rise to their feet, hands pounding together in admiration, in awe, in sheer disbelief at what they just witnessed. Some cheer, others whistle. Elijah, calm and composed, bends down to pick up his tray, straightens his shoulders, and meets Richard's stunned gaze with quiet confidence. The once arrogant billionaire, the man who had thought himself above everyone else, now looks like a fool in his own kingdom. "I hope that was to your satisfaction, sir," Elijah says smoothly, his voice steady, unwavering. The applause only grows louder. As the applause ripples through the room, Richard shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his once arrogant smirk replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. The atmosphere in the restaurant has transformed. What began as a spectacle meant to humiliate Elijah has turned into a moment of poetic justice. The very people who once laughed alongside Richard now murmur amongst themselves, nodding in approval at Jonathan Banks' words. Jonathan steps closer to Elijah, his expression warm but firm. "Respect is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It's something we all deserve," he says, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "And tonight, you proved that grace and dignity will always outshine arrogance." Elijah's hands tremble slightly as he processes Jonathan's words. Just moments ago, he was being mocked like a servant, treated as nothing more than background noise. Now, he's standing before one of the most powerful men in the industry, being offered an opportunity that could change his life. Elijah swallows hard, his voice catching in his throat. "I don't know what to say." Jonathan chuckles. "Say yes." A slow smile spreads across Elijah's face, his shoulders straightening with confidence. "Then yes, sir. I'd be honored." The restaurant erupts once more in applause, the sound swelling with genuine admiration. Several guests stand, clapping for the young man who had just turned his humiliation into triumph. Even some of the waitstaff wipe at their eyes, overwhelmed by the moment. Meanwhile, Richard sits motionless, his fingers tightening around his wine glass. His business partners, sensing his embarrassment, shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to offer him support or distance themselves from his public disgrace. Jonathan finally turns to Richard, his gaze cool and assessing. "You spend your life measuring a man's worth by his wealth, Richard," he says evenly. "But tonight, you just learned the hard way. Money doesn't make a man respectable." Character does Richard's mouth open slightly as if to respond, but no words come. He knows there's nothing he can say that won't make him look even smaller. Jonathan doesn't wait for an answer. He simply places a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Let's talk details tomorrow," he says with a knowing smile. "For now, Enjoy the rest of your night, son. You've earned it. Elijah exhales, still absorbing the weight of what just happened. He glances at Richard one last time, not with spite, not with anger, but with quiet victory. Because in the end, respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. As Richard storms toward the exit, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor, his once commanding presence now feels small, almost insignificant. The murmurs of the restaurant grow louder, no longer whispers but full-blown discussions about what just happened. Some shake their heads in disappointment, others smirk at the irony of it all. The powerful billionaire who had once controlled every room he walked into had just been put in his place by a man he saw as nothing more than the help. Elijah watches him leave, his heart pounding. A part of him expected Richard to fight back, to throw his wealth around like a shield, but there was no fight left in the man. Just humiliation, defeat, and most importantly, silence. The moment the restaurant doors swing shut behind Richard, an unexpected wave of applause sweeps through the room. First, a few guests, then the entire restaurant, including staff and customers standing and clapping for Elijah. The sound swells, filling every corner of the establishment with something far more valuable than money: respect. Jonathan, standing beside him, watches with an approving nod before clapping Elijah on the shoulder. That, he says with a small smile, was real power. Elijah exhales, still trying to wrap his mind around everything that just happened. One moment, he was being humiliated. The next, he was being celebrated. It felt surreal. The manager rushes forward, looking between Jonathan and Elijah, clearly rattled by everything that transpired. "Mr. Banks, I had no idea," he stammers. Jonathan waves him off. "That's the problem. People never think until it's too late." His gaze shifts back to Elijah. "You've got more grace and composure than most people I've met in this business, and that's exactly what I need in my company. Come see me tomorrow. We have a lot to discuss." Elijah swallows hard, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. He nods, standing taller than ever before. "Yes, sir, I'll be there." Jonathan smiles, then turns to the staff. "Everyone drinks on me tonight, and give Elijah the best meal in this house." A final round of cheers erupts as Elijah is led to a seat, not as a server, but as an honored guest. Outside, Richard Calloway steps into his car, gripping the steering wheel, his face still burning with shame. He thought money could buy him everything: respect, control, even entertainment at another man's expense. But tonight, he learned the hard way that true power isn't in the wealth you flaunt. It's in the dignity you carry. And tonight, Elijah had proven himself the richest man in the room. That night, as Elijah makes his way home, the cool night air feels different, lighter, charged with a new sense of purpose. His feet move steadily along the dimly lit sidewalk, but his mind is still replaying the events of the evening. The humiliation, the unexpected turn of fate, the applause, Jonathan Banks' words, it all feels surreal. As he nears a corner store, he hears the rhythmic beat of hands slapping against metal trash cans, followed by the unmistakable cadence of young voices rapping in unison. A group of kids, no older than 14, are gathered in a loose circle, their laughter and energy filling the night. They're freestyling, lost in their own world, their words raw and full of potential. One of them looks up, his face lighting up in recognition. "Yo, ain't you that dude from the restaurant? The one that shut down that rich guy?" Another boy chimes in, eyes wide with excitement. "Yeah, man, your video's all over the internet. You went viral." Elijah chuckles, shaking his head. "That fast, huh?" The boys nod eagerly, their admiration clear. One of them hesitates before asking, "Was it scary? Standing up to someone like that?" Elijah looks at them, young, full of dreams, but already aware of the way the world sometimes tries to silence them. He steps closer, his voice steady. Yeah, it was. But you know what? Fear doesn't mean you back down. It just means you push through anyway. The boys nod, soaking in his words. Elijah gestures toward their makeshift beatbox session. Every single one of you has a voice. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need permission to shine. The kids exchange looks, something shifting in their expressions, something deeper than just admiration. Inspiration. As Elijah walks away, he doesn't need to turn around to know they're still watching him, maybe seeing themselves a little differently now. The final shot, Elijah walking confidently into his future, his shoulders squared, his head held high. Richard Calloway's name trending for all the wrong reasons, his arrogance now a cautionary tale. A new generation realizing they too can rise above the people who try to hold them back. Because dignity isn't given, it's owned. And true talent doesn't need permission to shine.